The desert wind had carried Rashid Al-Mansour across oceans and continents to build an empire that stretched from Dubai to Manhattan. But on this particular Christmas Eve, it couldn't fill the cavernous silence of his Connecticut estate. At 68, he had everything a man could want, except the one thing money couldn't buy: his daughter, Layla, who had vanished into the American heartland 15 years ago after a devastating argument about tradition, freedom, and the unbridgeable gap between his world and hers. The mansion's 32 rooms echoed with memories of a little girl's laughter, now replaced by the hollow tick of antique clocks and the whisper of his housekeeper's footsteps. Rashid had spent a decade and a half searching, hiring investigators, following dead-end leads, until hope had crystallized into a permanent ache beneath his ribs. He'd learned to wear his wealth like armor, to let business consume the hours that family should have filled, to pretend that success could substitute for the warmth of a child's embrace. But tonight, as snow began to fall outside the floor-to-ceiling windows and carolers' voices drifted up from the distant village, the armor felt paper-thin. His phone, the one he'd kept with the same number for 15 years just in case, sat on the mahogany desk like a sleeping promise. Rashid stared at it while nursing his third cup of Arabic coffee, too restless to sit, too weary to stand. The Christmas tree his housekeeper had insisted on erecting seemed to mock him with its cheerful lights, a tradition from a culture he'd adopted for business but never quite understood. Yet Layla had loved Christmas as a child, had begged him to celebrate it alongside their own traditions, and he'd refused, clinging to the old ways with the rigidity that had ultimately driven her away. Now he would give anything, his fortune, his businesses, his prideful heart, just to hear her voice again. The night stretched before him like an endless desert, and Rashid Al-Mansour, who had conquered markets and built kingdoms, felt more alone than he had ever been in his life. Then, at precisely 11:47 p.m., the phone rang. Rashid's hand trembled as he reached for the phone, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force he thought it might burst through. The number was blocked, as so many spam calls were these days, and he nearly let it go to voicemail. But some instinct honed by 15 years of desperate hoping made him answer. "Hello?" His voice came out rougher than intended, gravelly with unshed tears, and the Arabic accent that decades in America had never quite erased. For a moment, there was only silence, and then a woman's voice, hesitant and achingly familiar despite the years that had reshaped it from girl to woman. Baba. The word hit him like a physical blow, that Arabic term of endearment he thought he'd never hear again, and suddenly he was gripping the desk's edge to keep from collapsing. "Layla, Layla, is it really you?" The question burst from him in a mixture of English and Arabic, all his carefully maintained composure shattering like glass. "It's me, Baba. I know I have no right to call after all this time, after the things I said, after just disappearing like that." Her voice cracked, and he could hear she was crying, could picture tears streaming down the face he'd memorized from old photographs, from dreams that had sustained him through endless lonely nights. "I've wanted to call so many times, picked up the phone 1,000 times, but I was so ashamed, so afraid you'd hate me for what I did, for breaking your heart. And Mama's heart." She broke off into sobs, and Rashid found himself crying too, tears he'd held back for 15 years, finally breaking free. "No, no, Habibti, my darling," he whispered fiercely. "There is no hate in my heart, only love, only missing you every single day. Where are you? Are you safe? Are you well?" The questions tumbled out urgently, desperately, because now that he'd found her again, the thought of losing her was unbearable. "I'm in Iowa, in a little town called Riverside. Baba, I'm sick, very sick." The words sent ice through his veins, and he was already reaching for his laptop, pulling up flight information with shaking fingers. "I have stage 3 cancer, and the treatments are so expensive, and I don't have insurance, and I didn't want to call because I didn't want you to think I only reached out because I need money. But my friend Mary convinced me that you'd want to know, that you'd want to—" Her voice dissolved again, and Rashid was standing now, pacing, his mind already calculating logistics with the sharp efficiency that had built his empire. "Stop, Layla, stop! I'm coming to you, tonight, now. Give me your address." He was already texting his pilot, his assistant, arranging everything with the speed of a man who'd spent his life making impossible things happen. "I don't care about the past, about our argument, about any of it. You're my daughter, my only child, and I'm coming to bring you home." The private jet cut through the winter sky like a silver arrow, carrying Rashid across the Midwest, while dawn painted the horizon in shades of rose and gold. He hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, his mind spinning through 15 years of what-ifs and if-onlys, replaying that terrible argument that had driven Layla away. She'd been 23, freshly graduated from Columbia, brilliant and beautiful, and burning with idealistic fervor about living her own life, making her own choices, not being constrained by traditions she hadn't chosen. He'd been 53, successful and stubborn, convinced that his way was the right way, that his daughter needed the guidance of arranged marriage to a suitable man from a good family, someone who understood their culture and values. They'd both said unforgivable things that night. He'd called her ungrateful and disrespectful. She'd called him controlling and trapped in the past. When he'd woken the next morning, she was gone, taking only a backpack and leaving behind a note that said simply, "I need to find out who I am without your money and your plans for my life. Please don't look for me." But of course he'd looked for her. He'd hired the best investigators, offered rewards, followed every lead no matter how slim. For the first 5 years, he'd been relentless, certain he'd find her and bring her home, convince her to return. His wife Amira, Layla's mother, had grieved herself into illness, dying 7 years ago with their daughter's name on her lips, and Rashid had never forgiven himself for letting pride and tradition destroy their family. After Amira's death, his search had become more mechanical, something he funded but no longer obsessed over, because the hope had slowly drained away, replaced by a dull acceptance that Layla was gone forever. He'd thrown himself into business, expanding his real estate empire, his technology investments, his philanthropic foundations, filling the void with work, because work didn't ask questions or require emotional vulnerability. But late at night, in the enormous mansion that had once echoed with a child's laughter, the loneliness would creep in like fog, suffocating and complete. Now, as Iowa's winter landscape spread below him, Rashid felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope mingled with terror. Layla was sick, possibly dying, and he'd wasted 15 precious years in stubborn silence instead of finding a way to bridge the gap between them. His hands clenched on the leather armrests as the plane began its descent into a small regional airport near Riverside. His assistant had arranged for a car, for medical consultations with the best oncologists in the country, for a suite at the local hospital if needed. But none of that mattered until he saw her, held her, told her all the things he should have said 15 years ago. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom announcing their approach, and Rashid closed his eyes, offering a prayer in Arabic, bargaining with God the way desperate fathers do. "Take everything I have, just let me save my daughter. Just give me time to make things right." The house was a tiny cottage on a street lined with snow-covered maples, so different from the mansions and penthouses Rashid inhabited that it might have been on another planet. He sat in the Blacktown car for a moment, staring at the peeling paint, the crooked porch railing, the flickering Christmas lights strung haphazardly around the door, and felt his heart clench with a mixture of pride and sorrow. His daughter had survived out here for 15 years without his money, without his connections, making her own way just as she'd insisted she would. The driver opened his door, but Rashid waved him back. This was something he needed to do alone. His legs felt unsteady as he walked up the narrow path, his expensive Italian shoes crunching through snow that hadn't been shoveled, his cashmere coat suddenly seeming ridiculous in this modest neighborhood where pickup trucks and economy cars lined the curbs. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, suddenly terrified that she'd changed her mind, that this was all a cruel dream, that the door would open and she wouldn't be there. But the door swung open before he could knock, and there she was, Layla, his daughter, 15 years older, heartbreakingly thin, her once lustrous black hair hidden beneath a colorful scarf that told him the cancer treatment had already begun. But her eyes, those dark eyes so like her mother's, were the same. They stared at each other across the threshold, and Rashid saw his own emotions reflected back at him. Love, regret, fear, hope, all tangled together in a not too complex to untangle. She looked fragile, this woman who'd been a sturdy, determined girl when she'd left, her skin pale against the bright turquoise of her headscarf, her frame swimming in an oversized cardigan that someone, not him, had bought her. "Baba," she whispered again, and that single word broke whatever spell had frozen them in place. He stepped forward, and she fell into his arms, and they both wept openly on that modest porch while morning light broke over Iowa and neighbors' curtains twitched with curiosity. "I'm so sorry," they said simultaneously, then laughed through their tears at the synchronicity. Rashid cupped her face in his hands, these hands that had signed billion-dollar deals and built empires, but had been empty of what mattered most. "No, Habibti, I'm sorry. I was a foolish, prideful old man who cared more about tradition than about your happiness, who drove you away with my rigidity and my need to control. Your mother," his voice broke on the word, "your mother died still missing you, still loving you, and I never found a way to bring you home to her. That is my burden, my failure." Layla's face crumpled at the mention of her mother, and he could see the guilt there, the weight of choices made in youth's certainty that had turned into regrets with time's perspective. "I didn't know," she sobbed. "I thought about calling so many times, but I was so stubborn, so convinced I had to prove I could make it on my own, and then time just kept passing, and it got harder and harder to bridge that gap until I convinced myself you were better off without me." Inside the cottage, a space so small his Manhattan penthouse's closet was probably larger, Rashid saw the life his daughter had built in exile. Photographs covered one wall, Layla teaching at what looked like a local elementary school, Layla volunteering at a food bank, Layla surrounded by smiling children of various ethnicities, her arms around them with genuine affection. Books overflowed from makeshift shelves, mostly children's literature and poetry, the kind of impractical, beautiful subjects she'd always loved and he'd tried to steer her away from in favor of business or law. A small Christmas tree stood in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn, the kind of humble charm that spoke of creativity rather than wealth. And everywhere, in Arabic calligraphy framed on the walls, in the hookah sitting unused on a shelf, in the scent of cardamom that drifted from the kitchen, he saw evidence that she hadn't rejected their culture entirely. She'd simply insisted on blending it with her own chosen path. A woman emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of tea, older than Layla, perhaps 70, with steel grey hair and kind blue eyes that assessed Rashid with protective concern. "You must be Layla's father," she said in a Midwestern accent as warm as her smile. "I'm Mary Patterson, Layla's landlord and friend. I'm the one who convinced her to call you." She set down the tray and extended her hand, which Rashid shook gratefully, recognizing in this stranger's face the care that should have been his to provide. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "Thank you for looking after her, for convincing her to reach out. I'm in your debt." Mary's expression softened with understanding, the kind that comes from having lived long enough to see how pride and stubbornness can fracture families. "She's been teaching at Riverside Elementary for 12 years, you know," Mary said, settling into a worn armchair while Layla poured tea with shaking hands. "The children adore her. She's received Teacher of the Year 3 times, made a real difference in this community." Rashid looked at his daughter with new eyes, seeing not the rebellious girl who defied him, but the woman she'd become. Purposeful, accomplished, beloved by others, even as she'd been lost to him. "I didn't know," he admitted, accepting the teacup and noting how Layla had remembered exactly how he took it. Strong, with a single sugar cube, the way his mother had taught her to prepare it when she was just a little girl in Dubai. "I didn't know anything about your life, what you'd achieved, who you'd become. I only knew the absence, the empty space where you should have been." Layla sat beside him on the lumpy sofa, so close their shoulders touched, and he could feel how thin she'd become, how the illness had carved away at her. "Tell me about the cancer," he he said gently but firmly. Tell me everything. When you were diagnosed, what treatment you've received, what the doctors have said, and then tell me about your life here. Everything I've missed. We have 15 years to catch up on, Habibti, and I intend to know it all. The story Layla told over the next hours was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a testament to resilience and the human capacity to build a meaningful life from nothing. She'd arrived in Iowa with $300 and a determination to prove she could survive without her father's fortune, taking whatever jobs she could find, waitressing, retail, cleaning houses, while putting herself through a teaching certification program at a community college. Those early years had been brutally hard, she admitted, living in a studio apartment with 4 other women, eating ramen and peanut butter, working multiple jobs, while studying late into the night. But she'd been driven by a fierce need to prove something, both to Rashid and to herself, that her worth wasn't tied to her father's money, that she could forge her own identity separate from being the daughter of Rashid Al-Mansour. She'd dated, loved, had her heart broken a few times, made friends who knew nothing of her family's wealth, and loved her for who she was, not what she could provide them. 8 months ago, she'd started feeling persistently tired, experiencing pains she'd initially dismissed as stress from teaching. By the time she'd finally seen a doctor, she'd been uninsured and had put it off, trying home remedies and hoping it would pass. The cancer had already progressed to stage 3, ovarian cancer, aggressive and advanced, requiring immediate treatment that cost more than she could ever afford on a teacher's salary. She'd started chemotherapy through a charity program at the regional hospital, sold what little she owned of value, accepted help from Mary and other friends who'd organized fundraisers and bake sales and spaghetti dinners to help with medical costs. But it wasn't enough, would never be enough, and the doctors had gently suggested she might want to consider getting her affairs in order, a euphemism she understood meant they were preparing her for the possibility of dying. That's when Mary insisted I call you, Layla said, her hand finding Rashid's. She said that whatever had happened between us, you deserved to know, deserved to have the choice to be part of my life again, even if it was just for the end. Not the end, Rashid said fiercely, his businessman's mind already working through solutions. Habibti, you're going to live. I'm going to make sure of it. He pulled out his phone, already texting his personal physician in New York, arranging consultations with the best oncologists in the country, specialists at Sloan Kettering and MD, Anderson, who owed him favors and would see her immediately. We're going to get you the best treatment available, whatever it costs, whatever it takes. I have money, more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and if it can save your life, then it's finally useful for something that matters. But Layla pulled back, and he recognized the stubborn set of her jaw, so like his own. I don't want to be saved by your money, Baba. I called you because I wanted to see you again, to apologize, to try to heal what broke between us before it's too late. But I won't let you buy your way back into my life. That was the whole point of leaving, remember? To be my own person, not just your daughter, not just an extension of your wealth and power. They argued, but differently than 15 years ago, not with the heat of pride and wounded feelings, but with the careful honesty of 2 people who'd learned the cost of letting anger and stubbornness destroy what mattered most. Rashid tried to explain that accepting help wasn't the same as being controlled, that a father's desire to save his daughter's life wasn't about money or power, but about love, pure and desperate. Layla countered that she'd spent 15 years building an identity separate from his wealth, and she couldn't simply abandon that now, couldn't let her entire life's purpose be undermined by running back to Daddy's money the moment things got hard. They went back and forth, while Mary sat quietly, occasionally interjecting gentle observations that reminded them both to listen as well as speak, to hear not just the words, but the love and fear beneath them. Finally, As afternoon light slanted through the cottage windows, they reached a compromise born of mutual respect and hard-won understanding. Rashid would arrange consultations with the best specialists, but Layla would make all final decisions about her treatment, maintaining agency over her own body. And medical choices. He would cover the medical expenses, not as a way to control her, but as a father's gift, freely given without strings or expectations. She would move into a larger space he'd rent nearby, not his Connecticut mansion. Not yet, because they both needed time to rebuild their relationship gradually, somewhere with room for both of them and Mary, who'd become like family to Layla, and who Rashid insisted should be compensated for the care she'd given his daughter when he couldn't. And most importantly, they would spend time together, really together, learning who each other had become in the years they'd been apart, building a new relationship based on mutual respect, rather than the traditional hierarchy of father knows best that had destroyed their old one. "I want to know everything," Rashid said, his hand covering Layla's where it rested on the worn sofa cushion between them. "I want to hear about your students, your friends, the life you've built here. I want to understand why you stayed in Iowa when you could have gone anywhere, what made you choose teaching when you'd been groomed for business. I want to know your favorite foods now, what books you love, what makes you laugh, what keeps you up at night besides the illness. I missed 15 years of your life, Habibti, and I can't get those back, but I can be present for whatever time we have going forward." His voice cracked on those last words, and Layla squeezed his hand tightly, her own eyes shining with tears. "And I want to know about you too, Baba. Not just the business mogul the newspapers write about, but you. How you felt when Mama died. What you've done with all those empty rooms in the mansion. Whether you found any peace or joy in the years since I left." Over the following days, while Rashid arranged for the best medical team money could assemble, father and daughter began the delicate work of rebuilding their relationship. They took slow walks through Riverside's snow-dusted streets, Layla showing him the elementary school where she taught, introducing him to colleagues who knew her as Miss Al-Mansour, beloved third-grade teacher, not as the daughter of a billionaire. He met her students' parents at a community potluck, ordinary working people who welcomed him with warm Midwestern hospitality, asking what he did for a living with genuine curiosity rather than the calculating interest he was used to in his usual circles. Rashid found himself charmed by this simple town, where everyone seemed to know everyone else, where people measured success, not in dollars but in kindness shown, community built, lives touched. He began to understand why Layla had chosen to stay here, why this modest place had become home when she could have lived anywhere. They talked for hours each evening, making up for lost time with stories and confessions, and slowly, carefully, honest conversations about the past. Layla told him about the loneliness of those first years away, how many times she'd almost called, how she'd followed his business dealings online with a mixture of pride and sorrow, watching from a distance as he built his empire. She admitted that leaving hadn't been just about asserting independence. It had been about fear, too. Fear that she'd never be good enough to live up to his expectations, that she'd always disappoint him by wanting different things than he wanted for her. "I thought, if I left, if I built my own life completely separate from yours, then I wouldn't have to constantly feel like I was failing you," she confessed one night, wrapped in blankets on her small porch while winter stars wheeled overhead. "But instead I missed you every day. I missed Mama. I missed being part of a family, even a complicated, sometimes frustrating family." Rashid shared his own truths, how he'd driven away the person he loved most because he couldn't bend, couldn't see that love sometimes means letting go, releasing control, allowing those we care about to make their own mistakes and find their own paths. He told her about Amira's final days, how her mother had whispered Layla's name at the end, had begged Rashid to find their daughter and tell her she was loved, she was forgiven, she was missed beyond measure. "I failed her," he said, his voice breaking. "I failed your mother by not finding you in time, by letting my pride keep me from trying harder, from being creative in my search, from maybe just showing up in places I thought you might be and hoping you'd give me a chance to apologize." He described the emptiness of the mansion, how he'd kept Layla's room exactly as she'd left it, a shrine to a daughter who'd felt more like a ghost than a real person as the years stretched on. I built all this wealth. He gestured vaguely back toward his distant empire, but I had no one to share it with, no one to leave it to, no one who cared about me rather than my money. I was so alone, Layla, so unbearably alone. The medical consultations began after Christmas, specialists flying in from New York and Houston to examine Layla, review her records, and develop an aggressive treatment plan. Rashid sat through every appointment, taking notes with the same intensity he brought to business negotiations, asking detailed questions about success rates and side effects and alternative approaches. The oncology team was cautiously optimistic. The cancer was advanced but potentially treatable with a combination of surgery, targeted chemotherapy, and immunotherapy that hadn't been available through Layla's charity care program. It would be brutal, they warned, months of difficult treatment with no guarantees, but there was hope where before there had been only a slow countdown to the inevitable. Layla signed the consent forms with shaking hands, and Rashid held her other hand through it all, promising he wouldn't leave her side, wouldn't let her face this alone, would be there through every treatment and setback and small victory. They moved to a spacious furnished house on the edge of Riverside, big enough for privacy, but close enough to Layla's beloved community that she could still feel connected. Mary took the guest suite, becoming part of their makeshift family, her practical Midwestern wisdom and gentle humor helping to ease the awkwardness of two people learning to be family again after so long apart. Rashid hired nurses and arranged for home health care, but he also learned to do the small, ordinary things he'd always had staff to handle, making Layla ginger tea when the nausea was bad, holding back her scarf when she was sick, reading to her during the long afternoons when the treatment left her too weak to do much but rest. He discovered that being present, really fully present, was harder and more meaningful than any business deal he'd ever negotiated, required a kind of patience and attentiveness he'd never developed in his years of commanding boardrooms and directing subordinates. Mary taught him how to cook simple, comforting American foods that were easier on Layla's struggling digestive system: chicken soup, mashed potatoes, plain rice pudding. He, in turn, showed Mary and Layla how to make the Arabic dishes his mother had prepared, the recipes he'd almost forgotten in his years of eating in expensive restaurants or having personal chefs handle everything. They found joy in these small rituals, gathered around the kitchen table in this rented house in the middle of America, 3 people from completely different worlds, creating something like family out of loss and hope and second chances. Rashid learned the names and stories of Layla's students, looked at their artwork on her refrigerator, read the get-well cards they'd made with childish sincerity. He began to see his daughter not as the girl who'd defied him, but as the woman who'd built something genuinely meaningful, a life of service and connection and love that his billions couldn't buy. The treatment was every bit as difficult as the doctors had warned. Layla lost the rest of her hair, though she faced it with humor, buying colorful scarves and outrageous wigs that made Mary laugh until she cried. She had days when the nausea was so severe she could barely lift her head, nights when the pain medication left her confused and tearful, moments when the fear and uncertainty would crash over her in waves that left her sobbing in Rashid's arms. But she also had good days, when the treatment seemed to be working, when her numbers improved, when she felt strong enough to video chat with her students or take short walks around the neighborhood. On those days, Rashid could almost forget the terror that shadowed them, could pretend they were simply a father and daughter, making up for lost time, building the relationship they should have had all along. He told her stories about her grandfather, about growing up in Dubai before the massive wealth came, about his own parents' traditional expectations, and how he'd rebelled in his own way by pursuing business in America. Layla shared her dreams for the future, not the vague, distant future, but the immediate one she was fighting for. She wanted to return to her classroom, to see her students through to the end of the school year. She wanted to write a children's book about cross-cultural understanding, something that would help kids, like the ones she taught, navigate between different worlds. She wanted to visit her mother's grave, something she'd been too afraid and ashamed to do before, but now felt desperately needed to do, to apologize and say goodbye and thank Amira for the love she'd always felt, even in absence. "And I want to really know you, Baba," she said one evening when the pain medication made her more openly emotional than usual. "Not just the apologizing and the regrets, but the good stuff too. What makes you happy? What do you dream about? If you could do anything with your life going forward, what would it be?" The question caught Rashid off guard, made him realize that for years, maybe decades, he'd stopped asking himself what brought him joy rather than just success. He thought about it seriously, examining his life with the honesty Layla's situation demanded. Because when your daughter is fighting for her life, pretense and evasion seem not just pointless, but obscene. "I think," he said slowly, "I'd like to do something meaningful with the wealth I've accumulated. Not just the usual philanthropic foundations and charity galas, but something personal, something connected to what matters. Maybe a foundation to help families rebuild after estrangement, resources for parents and children who've lost each other to pride and stubbornness, or scholarship programs for teachers like you, people who choose service over profit, who make the world better in quiet, uncelebrated ways." Layla's eyes filled with tears, and she reached for his hand. "That would be beautiful, Baba. That would make everything, all the pain, all the lost years, mean something." As winter deepened into January and February, Layla's treatment continued its brutal course. But slowly, incrementally, the news began to improve. The tumor markers were decreasing. The imaging showed the cancer responding to treatment. The surgical oncologist believed they could operate soon, remove what remained, give her a real chance at survival. The words remission and cure began to enter conversations, spoken cautiously but with growing confidence, and Rashid felt hope unfurl in his chest like something he'd forgotten existed. But even as the medical picture brightened, he understood that this experience had changed him fundamentally, had reordered his priorities in ways that couldn't be undone. The business empire that had once consumed his every waking hour now seemed almost irrelevant compared to the simple pleasure of sharing breakfast with his daughter, of hearing Mary's stories about her own children and grandchildren, of being part of a real community rather than just a wealthy man in an isolated mansion. He began making changes, delegating more to trusted managers, stepping back from the day-to-day operations that had filled the void where family should have been. He started exploring ways to establish the foundation he'd discussed with Layla, consulting with experts in family therapy and reconciliation, thinking about how wealth could be used to help heal the kinds of wounds that had nearly destroyed his own family. And he spent time in Riverside, getting to know Layla's world more deeply, visiting her classroom when she was well enough to return part-time, attending school board meetings and community events, discovering that there was something satisfying about being just Layla's dad rather than billionaire Rashid Al-Mansour. The simplicity of it, the ordinariness, felt like a kind of freedom he'd never known existed, even as he maintained the resources and connections to ensure his daughter received the best possible care. Mary watched this transformation with quiet approval, occasionally sharing her own wisdom gained from 70 years of living, loving, losing, and learning. She'd been widowed 20 years earlier, had raised 3 children who were now scattered across the country with families of their own, had learned the hard way that love required flexibility, that holding too tightly meant losing what you most wanted to keep. "My husband and I nearly lost our oldest son over his choice to marry someone we didn't approve of," she told Rashid one evening while Layla slept upstairs, exhausted from treatment. "We dug our heels in, insisted he was making a terrible mistake, and he stopped talking to us for 3 years. 3 years we lost because we couldn't accept that his life was his to live, his mistakes were his to make. When we finally swallowed our pride and reached out, apologized, welcomed his wife into the family, we got him back. But those lost years still ache sometimes." Spring came to Iowa in gentle stages, snow melting into mud, crocuses pushing through frozen ground, trees hazed with green as buds prepared to unfurl. Layla's surgery was scheduled for early April, a complex procedure, but one her strengthened body could now handle after months of treatment had shrunk the tumors enough to make complete removal possible. The night before the surgery, Rashid couldn't sleep, pacing the quiet house while Layla and Mary rested upstairs. He found himself in the small home office they'd set up, looking at photographs from the past months. Layla smiling despite her illness, the three of them at a riverside. Community dinner, Rashid awkwardly ice fishing with some of the local men who'd befriended him. These images told a story so different from the glossy photos that filled his Connecticut mansion. Pictures from charity galas and business functions where he smiled for cameras but never felt the warmth that showed in these casual snapshots from Iowa. He thought about calling his assistant to check on various business matters, then realized he didn't care. Not tonight, not when tomorrow his daughter would undergo surgery that could save her life or reveal that the cancer had spread beyond what the scans could see. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in years. He prayed, not the formal prayers of his youth, but a raw, desperate conversation with God, offering everything he had in exchange for Layla's life, for the chance to continue building this fragile, precious connection they'd reconstructed from the ruins of their relationship. He promised that if she survived, he would be different, would be better, would use his remaining years to help other families avoid the mistakes he'd made, to prove that money and success meant nothing compared to love and connection and the simple grace of being present for those who mattered most. The surgery took 8 hours, and Rashid spent every minute of it in the waiting room with Mary, drinking terrible hospital coffee and wearing a groove in the linoleum with his pacing. Mary knitted calmly, her needles clicking in a rhythm that was oddly soothing, occasionally looking up to offer reassurance or simply sit with him in companionable silence. Other families came and went, their own dramas playing out in this liminal space between crisis and resolution, and Rashid felt a kinship with these strangers that he'd never experienced in his usual world of privilege and power. When the surgeon finally emerged, still in scrubs, Rashid's heart seemed to stop. Every cell in his body focused on the expression on her face. "The surgery went very well," she said, and Rashid felt his knees go weak with relief. "We were able to remove all visible cancer, and we'll send everything to pathology, but I'm very optimistic. Your daughter is strong, Mr. Al-Mansour. She fought hard, and she's going to make it." Layla's recovery was slow but steady, each day bringing small victories that felt monumental to those who loved her. First sitting up, then walking with help, then graduating to short strolls through the hospital corridors with Rashid on one side and Mary on the other, their makeshift family supporting her through each difficult step. The pathology reports came back clean. No evidence of remaining cancer, margins clear, lymph nodes negative, words that sounded like poetry to Rashid, like the most beautiful language he'd ever heard. They'd caught it just in time, the oncologist explained. Another few months of delay might have made the outcome very different. Layla would need follow-up treatments, monitoring, years of scans and checkups, but the word survivor was now attached to her name, and that single word changed everything. When they finally brought her home to the riverside house, neighbors had decorated the porch with welcome home signs and left casseroles and baked goods, the kind of community care that money couldn't buy, but that sustained people through their hardest times. As Layla regained her strength, she and Rashid began planning for a future that now seemed possible rather than cruelly hypothetical. She would return to teaching in the fall, though perhaps part-time at first, easing back into the classroom she'd missed so desperately. Rashid would split his time between Connecticut and Iowa, maintaining his business interests but prioritizing presence over profit, relationships over returns. They talked about traveling together, once she was fully recovered, to Dubai so she could see where her father had come from, meet the extended family she'd never known, connect with half of her heritage she'd rejected, along with Rashid's controlling expectations. And they began serious work on the foundation, interviewing experts, developing programs, creating something meaningful from the pain of their lost years. "We'll call it the Amira Al-Mansour Foundation," Rashid suggested, "after your mother, who never stopped believing we'd find our way back to each other." But even as they planned, and hoped and built toward a shared future, Rashid knew that some wounds took longer to heal than a season or a year. There were still moments when old patterns emerged. His instinct to solve every problem with money, her defensive reactions when she felt he was trying to control rather than help. They argued sometimes, but differently now, with tools they'd learned from the family counselor they'd started seeing together, speaking in "I feel" statements, truly listening before, responding, apologizing without defensiveness when they'd hurt each other. It was hard work, this business of rebuilding trust and creating a relationship based on mutual respect rather than traditional hierarchy. But both of them were committed to it in ways they hadn't been 15 years earlier, when pride and stubborn certainty had driven them apart. "We're not trying to recover what we lost," their counselor had said. "We're building something new, something better, informed by pain, but not defined by it." That summer brought celebrations both large and small. Layla's cancer remained in remission, each clean scan a cause for grateful tears and quiet rejoicing. Her hair grew back in dark curls that surprised her. Chemo had changed its texture, but she loved the new softness, the way it framed her face as she regained weight and health. She introduced Rashid to her closest friends in Riverside, fellow teachers, neighbors, the small community of people who'd sustained her through hard times and who now welcomed her father not as a billionaire outsider, but as part of Layla's life, therefore worthy of acceptance. Rashid found himself attending barbecues and softball games, contributing to school fundraisers, not with massive checks that would dwarf everyone else's efforts, but with modest donations, appropriate to his role as simply another parent who cared about education. He learned to be comfortable with being Layla's dad, rather than demanding center stage, and discovered that invisibility had its own rewards. Mary became a permanent part of their family constellation, the wise elder who mediated when tensions rose and who reminded them both to focus on gratitude rather than regret. She taught Rashid the art of patience, of being present without needing to fix or control, of understanding that love sometimes meant simply sitting beside someone in silence while they processed their own feelings. And she helped Layla see that accepting her father's help and resources wasn't weakness or betrayal of her independence. It was the wisdom to recognize that we all need support sometimes, that family means being there for each other through crisis and celebration alike, that the goal wasn't complete self-sufficiency, but rather healthy interdependence. "You're both so stubborn," Mary would say with affectionate exasperation. "You come by it honestly, but good Lord, you make life harder than it needs to be. Love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. It just has to be present and genuine." In August, they traveled together to Dubai, Layla's first visit to her father's homeland since she was a small child. Rashid watched his daughter experience his world with adult eyes, seeing both its beauty and its complications, the tensions between tradition and modernity that he'd navigated his entire life. He introduced her to relatives who remembered her as a little girl, who wept to see her alive, and who welcomed her back into the family with open hearts despite the years of absence. They visited the grave of Rashid's parents, Layla's grandparents she'd barely known, and she laid flowers while Rashid told stories about them, helping her understand the cultural forces that had shaped his expectations and choices. And in a ceremony that blended Arab and American traditions, Rashid formally presented Layla to his extended family, not as an errant daughter finally brought to heel, but as a grown woman he was honored to call his child, whose choices he respected even when he didn't fully understand them. Autumn returned to Iowa, painting the trees in brilliant golds and crimsons, and Layla went back to her third-grade classroom with joy and renewed purpose. Her students welcomed her with handmade cards and enthusiastic hugs, and she threw herself into teaching with the fervor of someone who'd almost lost the chance to do the work she loved. Rashid visited the classroom occasionally, reading stories to wide-eyed children who couldn't comprehend that this kind, slightly awkward man with the interesting accent was actually a billionaire. He was just Emily's and Sam's and Jade's teacher's dad, which was the only identity that mattered to them. He found himself moved by these small humans' acceptance, their uncomplicated affection for Layla, the evidence of the difference she'd made in their lives. This, he realized, was legacy in its truest form, not buildings with his name on them or stock portfolios and real estate empires, but lives touched, children taught to be kind and curious, a community enriched by one woman's dedication. The Amira Al-Mansour Foundation officially launched in October, its mission to help families torn apart by cultural conflict, generational misunderstanding, or simple stubborn pride find paths back to each other. They funded family counseling programs, created resources for parents and adult children navigating estrangement, established scholarships for therapists specializing in cross-cultural family therapy, and trained mediators who could help families bridge seemingly unbridgeable gaps. Layla became the public face of the foundation, telling their story not to gain sympathy, but to offer hope to others struggling with broken family relationships. She spoke at conferences and community centers, sharing honestly about the lost years and the difficult work of rebuilding trust, emphasizing that it was never too late to reach out, never too late to apologize, never too late to try again. And Rashid supported her from behind the scenes, using his wealth and connections to ensure the foundation had resources and reach, proud of his daughter's courage in being vulnerable so that others might benefit from their hard-won lessons. They celebrated Christmas together that year, all of them, Rashid, Layla, Mary, and Mary's children and grandchildren who drove in from across the Midwest to be part of this expanding definition of family. The modest house in Riverside overflowed with laughter and cooking smells, children's excited chatter and adults' contentment, the kind of warm chaos that turns a house into a home. Rashid looked around at this gathering, so different from the lonely Christmas Eve that had nearly destroyed him a year earlier, and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. His phone, that same phone with the same number he'd kept for 15 years just in case, sat forgotten on a side table, and he realized he didn't need it anymore to hold on to hope. Hope was here, embodied in his daughter's laughter, in Mary's knowing smile, in the children playing around a tree decorated with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn. This was wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars, success that had nothing to do with market share or profit margins. As the new year began, Rashid and Layla found themselves settling into a comfortable rhythm, no longer working desperately to reconstruct what had been lost, but instead accepting what they'd built. Not a perfect relationship, but an honest one. Not free from conflict, but committed to working through it. Not erasing the past, but learning from it. They video called several times a week when Rashid was in Connecticut, sharing small details of their days. Layla's funny student stories, Rashid's foundation updates, Mary's latest observations about life and love. And several times a year, Rashid would spend weeks in Iowa, living in the Riverside house that had become as much home to him as his mansion, helping with homework supervision for Layla's students, attending school events, being part of the community that had saved his daughter when he couldn't. He kept his Manhattan apartment and Connecticut estate, maintained his business interests, but they were no longer the center of his identity. They were simply tools that enabled what really mattered. Layla's health remained stable, each cancer-free scan a new gift they didn't take for granted. She wrote her children's book, a story about a girl who learned to build bridges between two worlds instead of choosing just one, and Rashid wept reading it, recognizing their journey in its pages. She dedicated it to her mother's memory and her father's love, and when it was published by a small press that specialized in diverse voices, they held a book launch at Riverside, Elementary, that drew the whole town. Rashid stood in the back of the crowded gym, watching his daughter read to rapt children and proud parents, and thought about how close he'd come to missing this, to losing her entirely because he couldn't bend, couldn't accept that love sometimes means letting go of control. The thought still had the power to terrify him, but it also motivated him every day to choose presence over pride, connection over control, love over being right. They visited Amira's grave together in spring, laying flowers and speaking to her in a mixture of English and Arabic, telling her about their journey back to each other. "I think she knows," Layla said softly, her hand finding Rashid's as they stood before the marble headstone. "I think she's been watching over us, hoping for this, maybe even arranging it somehow from wherever she is. That phone call on Christmas Eve. Baba, I'd picked up the phone to call you 100 times before and always chickened out, but that night something just pushed me, made me brave enough to try." Rashid nodded, not certain he believed in such interventions, but willing to accept the comfort the thought provided. "Your mother always was stubborn about getting her way," he said with a sad smile. "If anyone could arrange second chances from beyond, it would be her." They stood in companionable silence, 3 generations connected by love that death couldn't sever and mistakes couldn't permanently destroy. The foundation grew beyond their initial expectations, helping hundreds of families navigate the difficult terrain of estrangement and reconciliation. Some reunions were as dramatic as theirs had been, long-lost children and parents finding their way back to each other after years or decades apart. Others were quieter, adult children and aging parents, learning to set healthy boundaries while maintaining connection, families finding ways to honor different values, and choices without severing ties completely. Not every story had a happy ending. Some wounds were too deep, some people too stubborn or damaged to do the work of healing. But enough families found their way back to each other that Rashid and Layla both felt their suffering had meaning. They'd taken their pain and transformed it into something that helped others, and there was profound satisfaction in that alchemy of turning loss into service, regret into resources for change. Rashid discovered, somewhat to his surprise, that he enjoyed the foundation work more than he'd ever enjoyed business, despite being less good at it in conventional terms. In business, he'd been decisive, commanding, accustomed to making things happen through force of will and strategic thinking. In family reconciliation work, those skills were sometimes useful, but often counterproductive. The work required patience, humility, the ability to listen without solving, to support without controlling. He had to learn to let the professionals lead, to recognize that his role was providing resources and support rather than directing outcomes. It was humbling in ways that business had never been, but also deeply rewarding. When a mother thanked him through tears for funding the family therapy that had helped her reconnect with her estranged son, or when a young woman shared that the foundation's resources had given her the courage to reach out to the father she'd cut off. 5 years earlier, Rashid felt a satisfaction that no successful business deal had ever provided. Layla expanded her own work beyond just teaching, becoming a consultant for the foundation, helping develop culturally sensitive approaches to family reconciliation, particularly for families navigating cross-cultural conflicts. She drew on her own experience, straddling Arab and American worlds, understanding both the pull of tradition and the need for personal autonomy, the validity of cultural values, and the importance of individual choice. She became a sought-after speaker, not as Rashid Al-Mansour's daughter, but as Layla Al-Mansour in her own right, an educator and advocate whose insights came from lived experience and professional expertise combined. Rashid attended her presentation sometimes, sitting in the audience with Mary, watching his daughter command a room not with his money or connections, but with her own intelligence, compassion, and hard-won wisdom, and feeling pride so intense it was almost overwhelming. As years passed, the acute crisis that had brought them back together faded into memory, replaced by the steadier, quieter work of maintaining relationship across distance and difference. Layla remained cancer-free, eventually declared fully in remission, though the experience had left marks, not just physical scars, but an awareness of life's fragility that influenced every choice she made. She lived more intentionally, said, "I love you" more freely, forgave herself and others more quickly, having learned that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed and that grudges were a luxury she could no longer afford. Rashid, too, had changed profoundly. His priorities had permanently shifted. his understanding of success fundamentally reordered. He was softer now, quicker to show emotion, less afraid of vulnerability, having learned that strength sometimes looked like admitting you were wrong and asking for forgiveness. Mary remained their anchor, the wise witness to their ongoing evolution, occasionally pointing out when old patterns tried to reassert themselves: Rashid's tendency to solve problems with money rather than presence, Layla's defensive independence that sometimes prevented her from asking for help even when she needed it. "You two are works in progress," she'd say with affectionate exasperation, "but at least you're progressing." That's more than a lot of families can say. Her own children and grandchildren had been absorbed into the extended family web, creating a blended clan that crossed cultural, generational, and socio-economic lines, united not by blood or tradition, but by choice, commitment, and genuine affection. Holiday gatherings were chaotic, multilingual affairs, with Arabic food and American traditions mixing freely. Children who didn't share DNA calling Rashid grandpa and arguing over who got to sit next to him at dinner. On quiet evenings, when it was just the three of them, Rashid, Layla, and Mary, in the Iowa house that had become their emotional home, even as they all maintained other residences, they would sometimes reflect on the journey that had brought them to this place. The lost years would always ache. That was a scar they all carried, but there was also gratitude for the crisis that had forced them to reach out, to try again, to build something new from the ruins of what had been broken. "Do you ever think," Layla asked one evening, as they watched snow begin to fall outside the windows, "about what would have happened if I hadn't gotten sick, if I'd just kept going year after year, too proud and afraid to call?" Rashid was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think we would have lost each other entirely," he said honestly, "and that would have been a tragedy far worse than any business failure or any amount of money lost. So in a strange way, I'm almost grateful for the cancer that brought us back." Together, Rashid began spending more time in Iowa than Connecticut, finding that the simpler life suited him better than the isolated luxury of his mansion. He developed genuine friendships in Riverside, men and women who knew about his wealth but didn't care, who valued him for his willingness to show up at community events, his donations to the school and library, his presence at church suppers and town hall meetings. He learned to play poker with a group of retired farmers who teased him mercilessly about his expensive watch and terrible bluffing skills. He volunteered at Layla's school, reading to students and helping with math tutoring, finding unexpected joy in these children's uncomplicated acceptance. And he discovered that happiness didn't require the constant stimulation and achievement he'd thought necessary. It could be found in morning coffee on the porch, in conversations that meandered rather than driving toward conclusions, in the satisfaction of being useful in small, concrete ways. He thought often about the man he'd been on that lonely Christmas Eve when Layla's call had come through, about how close he'd been to spending the rest of his life in that hollow place where success meant nothing, because there was no one who really mattered to share it with. That version of himself seemed almost like a stranger now, so rigid, so certain, so terribly alone, without fully realizing how alone he was. He'd built walls around his heart, with tradition and pride and the conviction that his way was the only right way, and it had taken nearly losing his daughter forever, twice, first to estrangement and then to cancer, to break those walls down. "I wish I'd learned these lessons earlier," he told Mary one day. "I wish I'd been flexible enough, humble enough to bend before things broke. I could have had 38 years with my daughter instead of just these last few." But Mary, with her characteristic wisdom born of having lived through her own share of mistakes and regrets, offered a different perspective. "Maybe you couldn't have learned it earlier. Maybe you had to lose everything to understand what really mattered. Maybe Layla had to go away and build her own life to become someone you could have an equal relationship with, rather than just trying to control. Maybe it all had to happen exactly the way it did, painful as it was, to get you both to this place where you can really see and appreciate each other." She patted his hand gently. "Don't waste the gift of this second chance by focusing too much on the lost time. Instead, honor it by being fully present for the time you have now. That's what Layla needs, what she's always needed. Not your money or your grand gestures, just your presence, your acceptance, your love without conditions or expectations." As Rashid approached 70 and Layla her 40s, they settled into a relationship that would have been unrecognizable to their younger selves, built on mutual respect, honest communication, acceptance of differences, and the hard-won wisdom that love sometimes means letting go of control and expectations. They still disagreed sometimes, still had to consciously choose patience and understanding over old patterns of stubbornness and pride. But the foundation was solid now, tested by crisis and strengthened by commitment, and they both knew it would hold. Layla continued teaching, writing, more children's books, working with the foundation, building a life rich in purpose and connection, even if it would never be wealthy in conventional terms. And Rashid had found peace in supporting her work rather than trying to redirect it, in being part of her world rather than insisting she fit into his. The foundation had become a lasting legacy, helping hundreds of families navigate the treacherous waters of estrangement and reconciliation, providing resources and support that hadn't existed when Rashid and Layla were struggling through their own healing process. They'd created something that would outlast them both, that would continue helping families long after they were gone, and there was deep satisfaction in knowing their pain had been transformed into something that eased others' suffering. Amira would have been proud, Rashid thought often, proud of their courage to try again, proud of the bridge they'd built between tradition and change, proud of the family they'd created that honored both her memory and their own hard-won growth. In the end, that was all anyone could hope for, to take the broken pieces of what had been lost and reshape them into something meaningful, to turn regret into purpose, to choose love and connection over pride and isolation. On Christmas Eve, 5 years after that desperate phone call that had saved them both, Rashid and Layla stood together in the Iowa house, surrounded by their expanded family, Mary and her clan, Layla's close friends, students who'd become like adopted children, colleagues from the foundation. The tree sparkled with lights, carols played softly in the background, and the air smelled of Arabic coffee mingled with Mary's famous Christmas cookies. Rashid looked at his daughter, healthy, happy, loved and loving, and felt his heart overflow with gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. She caught his gaze and smiled, that same mischievous smile she'd had as a little girl, and crossed the room to hug him tightly. "Merry Christmas, Baba," she whispered. "Thank you for answering the phone. Thank you for coming to find me. Thank you for loving me enough to change." And Rashid held his daughter close, this precious gift he'd almost lost forever, and whispered back, "Thank you for calling, Habibti. Thank you for giving me a second chance. Thank you for teaching me that love means letting go." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the world in white, making everything new